Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. People have hated all of the latest Democratic candidates, including Obama, because they didn't do what they wanted, and they appeared to not actually stand for anything or have any principles. Now Bernie, that was a guy with consistent principles and hasn't changed in decades. However, in an electoral republic or democracy, whether you like it or not, that's not what a representative is. They aren't some bastion poster child of an ideology. If they can be consistent, then they're in a very lucky position to be in a fairly politically unchanging representative role. Not changing most often gets you fired. Paul Ryan, Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Bernie, Warren, AOC all represent an ideology, and if the public likes it, they will re-elect the person, and in our first-past-the-post, heavily gerrymandered system, in the deep red or deep blue areas, that works. Vermont, Massachusetts, AOC's district in New York City, all heavily blue. Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Paul Ryan, all blood red areas with little change. Opinion shifts don't change enough to primary or unseat them. However, most politicians don't have that luxury. A good politician represents their constituents and takes the average of the position as best as the data can tell them. Biden and Hillary and Obama all did this. Some people seem to not realize that when people say Biden was racist, when he wrote the crime bill, what they meant was the state of Delaware was on average racist and approved of the crime bill. When Obama called drone strikes, it meant the average American wanted drone strikes instead of our troops dying. When Hillary was for TPP, all of the data she had was that the majority of Democrats and independents wanted TPP until they weren't. Politicians don't tend to view themselves as vanguards of change like Bernie or Paul Ryan, and there are only very special cases where they can be. They see themselves as doing a service for the people by translating the voice of the average opinion into law. If these politicians had crappy views, the people they represented also had crappy views, and then somehow people hold them to account for the opinions of the people they represented. Republicans even do this to the same extent, though lately they have been much more grifters and con artists. Obama changed his mind on same-sex marriage because America went from being against it to being for it at a breakneck pace among people who voted. Want to get the politician to care about your cause? Vote. Always vote. If they can count on your constituency to vote for them, they will do what you want. Principled politicians often have their own views on things, but when they represent the people, they hold different positions based on what the average person wants. Angela Merkel did not vote for same-sex marriage because her constituents were completely against it, but the German people were for it, so she allowed the vote to go through as chancellor who represents the German people. People on the left called Hillary, Biden, and Obama neoliberals as if they had actively worked for neoliberal values. This is just wrong on so many levels. The Dems don't treat their job as an ideology. For one thing, they can't, thanks to the big tent process of first past the post. Just because Bernie and Ron Paul treat their ideals as what drives them as ironclad, that's only because that's what their constituents like. Dems believe in representative democracy, meaning they take the exact average of what the people want, though a bit more skewed to the right or left, depending on party thanks to our two-party system. Democrats aren't neoliberal, especially Biden. He's a politician. He believes that he has to represent at least the opinions of most of the people and do what it takes to get elected. He literally takes the temperature of the independents and Democrats and sets himself solidly in the center, like most politicians have to do unless they're lucky enough to live in a state and take an absolutist stance like Ron Paul or Bernie. Reagan and Thatcher tricked their nations into falling for neoliberalism, and so the nation was neoliberal. So most politicians, especially Democrats, to represent their constituents, in spite of their personal views, took the more neoliberal stance because their constituents were so neoliberal. To say Biden is anything is dumb. Unlike Bernie, who uses his seat as a pulpit, Biden and the rest of the Dems go where the voters tell them to go. Biden doesn't have a super strong ideology, and if he does, he keeps it to himself, as a form of social liberalism because he's not lucky enough to have lived in a solid blue state. He just represents the Dems and independents he represents. No more, no less. And Bernie actually agrees with this, as he has literally said that Biden could be the most progressive president since FDR. And he knows this not because Biden is an ideological leftist, but because the people voting for Bernie, AOC, and other self-identified democratic socialists have gotten so many votes nationwide, something that would have been completely unthinkable a decade ago. It allows Biden to abandon the Clinton third wave adopted when the voters were way more neoliberal, and it was change or die politically, just like Carter, Mondale, and Dukakis did, who tried to stick with the old Great Society mindset of LBJ. Biden, who used to be a Great Society Democrat, had to abandon that in favor of what the people wanted. And the reason why so many progressives are winning is purely because the population is finally getting more progressive. Good politicians reflect the will of their constituents. Bad constituents then judge the politicians and punish them for their past decisions when the politicians change their minds when their constituents do. If you hate how a Democratic candidate acted in the past, if you are older, please look in the mirror, and if you are younger, realize that that's what your parents and grandparents voted for, and are actually to blame. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this, and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video, or my Facebook page, After School Democracy. Link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis 2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.